Earlier we saw how Oskar Dirlewanger fought in World War I, where, despite being badly wounded several times, always managed to return to the front. Despite the end of the war, he managed to bring 600 men back to Germany from occupation duties in the east. He joined Freikorps units fighting against socialist insurgents in Germany and ethnic Poles in Silesia. He was wounded once more in 1921, and this time it was bad enough to get him knocked out of the paramilitary for a long time. He was an early member of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. He went to university and got a degree. When the Nazis were granted power in 1933, like many old fighters, he was given a job here in Heilbronn in southwestern Germany. However, he seems to have resented some of the jobs given to the other old fighters, jobs they were clearly not capable of doing, whilst he had a university education and was qualified for the position he had been given. This caused jealousy, and Dirlewanger found himself being investigated for rape amongst other charges. He went to prison, and on getting out decided to go to Spain and fight in the war there. His old friend from the First World War, Gottlob Berger, took him under his wing. Berger by this time was high up in the National Socialist administration. Berger arranged for him to head a special unit to do the particularly dirty tasks that others might not want to do. The composition of the troops under him was mainly made up of former prisoners, recruited from here, the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. These men were based around a core of people convicted of poaching and professional criminals, 2 expelled SS officers. The character of the leader and his vigorous troop leadership made the Dirlewanger Special Commando one of the most notorious units of the war. Even during its deployment in the general government, it had attracted attention through their high-handedness and brutal excesses. On the 2nd of November 1941, SS Judge Konrad Morgen, who was then working at the SS and Police Court 6 in Krakow, reported to the SS Court headquarters on daily arrests, extortion of money, and looting of Jewish property by members of the unit. The looted items were then sold to other Jews. Dirlewanger is said to have had strange relationships with pretty Jewish women and then killed them by injecting them with strychnine. The Lublin ghetto was literally pillaged by Dirlewanger and his men. The SS and police leader in charge there, Globocnik, knew this but did nothing about it. The head of the local Gestapo, SS-Sturmbannführer Johannes Müller, who was a subordinate to him, called the Dirlewanger commando a plague on the land. Morgen presented the higher SS and police leader in the general government, Krüger, with an arrest warrant for Dirlewanger, but Krüger declared himself incompetent in such matters and forwarded the complaint to Berger. The result was Dirlewanger's transfer to Belarus. When resistance activity in the Lublin district rose sharply and police reinforcements were requested, Gottlob Berger made the following telling remark in a letter to Himmler dated the 17th of June 1942. Perhaps it is now also a warning that a wild country is being turned into a fine country. The rules of civilized society cannot govern here, and the principle of the special commando, better to shoot 2 Poles than 1 too few, was the right one. The Dirlewanger unit carried out the fight against partisans in Belarus by using the most brutal means. If partisans were found in a village, or if a village had not fulfilled its delivery quota of agricultural products, the entire population was killed in the most cruel way. Everyone, including women and children, were locked in barns which were set on fire, and those trying to get out were shot at random. The companies involved in the actions then arrived at their quarters with whole wagons full of loot. This action against the population, such as the senseless destruction of villages, provoked protests from the General Commissioner for Belarus, Wilhelm Gruber. However, his complaints to Rosenberg, the Minister for the Eastern Territories, were ineffective. The brutality of the troops, however, was justified in the opinion of Berger, who said that the behaviour of their commanding officer exceeded all expectations. During the suppression of the uprising in Warsaw in August and September 1944, Dirlewanger allowed his men to loot. He himself not only took part in this, but he even shot members of his own unit in order to get a hold of the jewellery that they had stolen. As the unit of criminals worked its way east through the Polish capital, normally behind the regular army, and usually in a drunken stupor, it murdered tens of thousands of people. I've done separate videos on the Wola massacre and the Warsaw Uprising. Colonel General Guderian tried to get Hitler to personally remove Dirlewanger's and Kaminski's units from the Eastern Front. He was supported in this by SS Brigadeführer Fegelein, Hitler's posthumous brother-in-law. "Yes, mein Führer, they really are scoundrels," said Fegelein. Nevertheless, Dirlewanger was received with honour by Governor-General of occupied Poland, Hans Frank. Gottlob Berger himself wrote in a letter to Himmler in October 1943 about the unqualified behaviour of my special commando, Dr. Dirlewanger, who, as far as I could determine, behaved inappropriately in every respect. He defended Dirlewanger against all attacks and was able to prevent his legal prosecution. Dirlewanger was his vassal and mercenary who could be used for anything, especially with the fighting methods it used in Belarus and in Warsaw. The formation, recruitment and practice of this unit are an example of the unscrupulousness with which the National Socialist leadership waged the war, even before it officially became a total war. At the end of January 1945, Dirlewanger and his troops found themselves on the Oder front in the area around Guben. Heavy fighting was taking place. Dirlewanger once more showed his utter contempt for fear, and once more he was wounded, this time a gunshot wound to the chest. Dirlewanger was sent to a military hospital and SS-Sturmbannführer Fritz Schmieders took over command. On the 19th of February 1945, Himmler ordered that the brigade be expanded to become the 36th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, but in doing so it no longer bore Dirlewanger's name. I think that this shows that whereas Dirlewanger's bravery might have been recognised, it was also recognised that he had a lack of any staff training, and whereas this mightn't have made any difference when he was fighting unarmed civilians, it wasn't much good when it came to commanding troops in battle, fighting trained soldiers who were armed. When Dirlewanger was released from hospital, he went to Berlin, where he stayed with his old friend Gottlob Berger from the 15th to 20th of March 1945. Thoughts of avoiding the inevitable defeat must have been their main subject of conversation. After this, he returned to his parents' house in Esslingen am Neckar. Dirlewanger had spent the war not only fighting the defenceless, but also in enriching himself. Now recovering from his wounds at his parents' home in Württemberg in southwest Germany, he attempted to arrange for the transport of some of the stolen property where it would be far away from the front and safe. On the 22nd of April 1945, he went to Allgäu-Immenstadt in southwestern Bavaria, close to the Austrian border. Ironically, many years later in 2004, I was there on the trail of Lorenz Hackenholt, a Nazi criminal who'd been at Beaujet's, and the hunt brought me to this area. In the case of Dirlewanger, it would seem that he was visiting Robert Bosch, who was a friend of Berger's. Here, Dirlewanger got rid of his SS Oberführer uniform and exchanged it for civilian clothes. It is usually assumed that he was hiding here in the Thalheimer Tal, just over the border in Austria, although at some time he travelled 80 kilometres west to Althausen. This seems a rather odd place to go to without a reason. It would be more difficult to hide here. Furthermore, he was putting distance between himself and the possibility of an escape via Switzerland. Christian Herbel lived in Althausen. He had murdered an African man, perhaps a French prisoner of war, and he'd been sent to Dirlewanger's unit as a cook in order to rehabilitate himself. As this part of Germany was liberated by the French army, roadblocks were set up to examine the papers of the very many stragglers on the roads, which included millions of displaced persons, bombed out civilians, former prisoners of war, German soldiers, and of course war criminals. The border with Switzerland was sealed. Dirlewanger was picked up in Altshausen by French forces. Dirlewanger was not held alone. Years later, in 1958, Luftwaffe Lieutenant Anton Füssinger testified to the Criminal Commissariat Ravensburg the following: I was in the local prison Althausen from the 1st of June to the 5th of June 1945 with 2 other prisoners in the same cell. We introduced ourselves with our family names. One of them turned out to be August Mink from Oberndorf am Neckar. The other one presented himself as Dirlewanger without any further information. On the first day I did not learn anything more about him. However, on the second day, the Polish concentration camp prisoners working as guards called him Colonel. I asked him what it meant. He told me that it meant that he was a colonel. Afterwards, he answered further questions. Later on, after we stayed together a little longer, he admitted to having served in the Waffen-SS. Dirlewanger had been detained because of concentration camp prisoners who had claimed that he was the commander of a camp, as his name was listed on the board at the entrance to the concentration camp. He explained in our presence that he was not the commander of the camp, but only temporarily served as a guard with this battalion. In this case, I think, and I'm probably wrong, but it seems to me that this is possibly Zwangsarbeitslager for Juden Stare Dzikov, which is around 10 kilometers northwest of Lubachów and around 20 kilometers to the southwest of Belarus. I must insist that I could be wrong. Continuing the account of Luftwaffe Lieutenant Anton Füssinger. In front of the cell door there was a French soldier, a guard in a red kepi, well, probably a navy blue kepi with a red stripe. Nevertheless, when I was arrested, I did not see the Frenchman, but rather armed and uniformed Poles. On the next day, a 16-year-old Jew from Ebersbach near Althausen came. The guards let him punch us in the face, which he did under the supervision of the Poles until he got tired. We returned to the cell with our faces completely shattered. I myself had been beaten on the same day by the Poles, and only because I refused to shout 3 times, "I'm a German pig." Dirlewanger and Munch were pulled out of the cell into the corridor every night and brutally beaten. I heard blows and terrible screams. In daylight I would see bleeding open wounds on the faces of Mika and Dirlewanger, and their entire bodies covered with bleeding welts. Mika and Dirlewanger were taken from their cells separately 3 times on the night of the 4th-5th of June 1945 and beaten in the corridor. After they returned to their cell for the 3rd time, they could no longer speak or stand. After a short time, the guards came to the cell again and ordered them to get up and follow them. Neither Meek nor Dirlewanger could lift themselves. Then the guards began to strike them with rifle butts in their heads so that their heads turned into an indiscernible bloody pulp. Then they started kicking them in the stomachs. After that, the guards left both of them lying in the cell unconscious. I am surprised that the registration of death, which was completed by the French commandant, shows that Dirlewanger died only on the 7th of June 1945 and Mink on the 8th of June 1945. It was deliberately erroneous, since the document indicates that both had died of natural causes. I can testify at any time in a court under oath that Mink and Dirlewanger died of the wounds sustained during the beating by Polish guards. Betty Angele, née Stenle, was a German Red Cross nurse in Altshausen. She informed the officers of Criminal Commissariat Ravensburg that the reason Dirlewanger was arrested was that he could not produce the necessary travel documents. He said that he was convalescing in Upper Swabia from the gunshot wound sustained in February 1945. She said that in the beginning of June 1945 she brought food to the prison for Füssinger, who was a friend from Ebersbach. She said, "There were 2 men in the cell with him. I did not know the names during my visits. Only after their deaths did I find out that it was Mink, head of the local Gestapo office, and the SS officer Dirlewanger. By looking at him, you might assume he was about 60 years old. Actually, he was 10 years younger. At the time, I thought that such an elderly person could not be a soldier, and I believed that he'd been arrested by the French for having no papers on him. During my first visit, Dirlewanger asked me whether I knew why he was detained at Altshausen. I replied I didn't know. I then asked where he came from. Dirlewanger told me that he'd been in a hospital, and if my memory is correct, he said he came from Mengen, a town in Baden-Württemberg in the Tübingen district, 23 kilometers northwest of Altshausen. The French appointed German mayor Hugo Riegel duly registered the death of Dirlewanger and Mink. The French ordered the coffin in the morning of the 8th of June. They made sure that the coffin could not be opened until the funeral at 11 o'clock. They explained to the summoned Catholic priest, Josef Romer, that he would hold a service at SS Oberführer Dirlewanger. The entry in the register of deaths was as follows: died because of abuse by the guards. And I'm going to give it to you in the original, so there'll be no question of me making a mistake in the translation. Gestorben an den Misshandlungen der Wache. His death certificate was not issued until the 19th of June 1945, which is also the date of his burial. So who were the Poles that killed Dirlewanger and Mink? It's not known. They could have been former slave labourers or French prisoners of war of Polish descent, or Polish soldiers who served in the French First Army. There would be the 29e Groupement d'Infanterie Polonaise. The 16-year-old Jew mentioned could have been someone who escaped from a death march, or could have been somebody who'd been on one, or could have been any one of millions of displaced persons on the road in Germany at that time. What is clear is that the killings were targeted. The Luftwaffe officer was beaten up, but he wasn't killed. The only reason I can think of as to why they were killed is that one was the head of the local Gestapo and the other was an SS officer. I very much doubt if those that assaulted Dirlewanger knew that he was the mass murderer of tens of thousands in the Wola district of Warsaw and of tens of thousands in the swamps and forests of Belarus. Until the 1960s, rumours circulated that Oskar Dirlewanger had survived the war. In 1960, the Ravensburg Public Prosecutor's Office ordered the exhumation of the body. The forensic medical examination clearly showed that the buried person was Dirlewanger. Despite this proof, it did not stop the conspiracy theorist Gottlob Berger to speculate to the historian Helmut Haber in 1962 that his friend was alive and well, advising the great and powerful in Syria or Egypt. As far as the crimes of Dirlewanger are concerned, they came up at the trial of Gottlob Berger, and he was found guilty of initiating them. Of 35 criminal proceedings initiated by the judiciary in West Germany in the 1960s, only one led to the indictment and conviction of 4 former special unit members for involvement in crimes against Jewish slave labour camp prisoners. I hope you found that interesting. It took some time to actually do this. I am now in Warsaw and trying to do things related to the Warsaw Uprising, which will be 80 years this year. I'm doing this in July 2024. I have a lot more information about the Warsaw Uprising, as well as many other things related to the Third Reich. If this is the sort of thing that interests you, then you might want to consider subscribing. For the moment, I'm going to suggest you have a look at a video I did on the Verbrennungskommando. These were the people who burned the bodies of those that had been murdered by Dirlewanger and others.